Here are 3 additional proofs for section 5.3. So we always want to start with our givens. And neither of these givens are marked in our picture. So let's mark segment PS is congruent to segment RQ, and segment SR is congruent to segment QP. So we already have 2 pieces of information. So next step, do we have reflexive property or vertical angles? In this case, we have reflexive property because side PR is congruent to side PR in the, so segment PR in the bottom triangle is congruent to segment PR in the top triangle. It's a shared side and it's the same side, so we know that it's congruent to itself by the reflexive property. And now we have 3 pieces of information. We have side, side, side in one triangle that's congruent to side, side, side in our second triangle. So we can conclude by the side, side, side congruency postulate that triangle PSR is congruent to triangle RQP. All right, copy down your givens. All right, so we have segment AB is congruent to segment CB. So I'll mark that in our picture, and that is a given. And then we also have segment BD is an angle bisector of angle ABC. So notice it says it's an angle bisector. So here we have angle ABC, and the angle is getting bisected by segment BD, which means that it is getting cut in half. So we know that this half is congruent to this half. So we can actually write angle ABD is congruent to angle ABD is congruent to angle CBD. And that is by definition of angle bisector, because this angle ABC is what's getting bisected. And then our next step, do we have reflexive property or vertical angles? In this case, we have reflexive property because we have this segment BD that belongs to our left triangle and our right triangle. And it's the same side. So of course it is congruent to itself. So segment BD is congruent to segment BD by the reflexive property. And now we have 3 pieces of information. We have side included angle side, because that is the angle that's between these 2 sides, and then side angle side. So by the side angle side congruency postulate, we can conclude that triangle ABD is congruent to triangle CBD. And our last one, copy down your givens. So angle P is congruent to angle S. And R is the midpoint of segment QT. So I'm going to highlight segment QT. Again, I always suggest doing this, highlighting the segment so that you make sure you get the correct halves. So if R is the midpoint, we know that this half is congruent to this half. And that's just by definition of what a midpoint is. A midpoint is the middle, so it cuts it into 2 equal halves. So this was given, and because of that given, we know that segment QR is congruent to segment RT by definition of midpoint. So we already have two pieces of information. Step number 2, check for reflexive property or vertical angles. In this case, we have vertical angles that are across from each other and vertical angles that vertical angles are across from each other and they are congruent. Notice I used 2 tick marks because we already used 1 tick mark for angle P and angle S. You cannot call this angle R. We have to use 3 letters. So let's call this angle PRQ is congruent to angle, and now I would just use your congruency statement. PRQ is congruent to angle SRT. And you see PRQ goes from 1 blue tick mark to the green side. So angle SRT is going from the blue angle tick mark to the green side. So you can see that those are actually, the corresponding parts are matching up. So this is vertical angles. And now we have 3 pieces of information. So let's figure out which congruency postulate makes our triangles congruent. So we have angle, angle, and then this non-included side. Angle, angle, non-included side. So by the angle, angle, side congruency theorem, we can say that triangle PQR is congruent to triangle STR. Now what I caution you against is when you're figuring out this order, a common mistake is to do this. A common mistake is to think that this is angle, side, angle. But it's not, because if you go in that order, you're completely skipping over angle Q, right? Which we don't know anything about. So instead, you have to go angle, angle, side.